Okay, so I thought I would do a short PowerPoint video that talks about what fantasy fiction really is, with a focus on fantasy fiction for children. Okay, so to start with, what is fantasy? Well, as Dr. Brian Atterbury says, fantasy literature is literature of the impossible. These are things that happen that couldn't happen according to our natural laws. The settings can be magical or imaginary. The characters are not always human. Sometimes they're animals that talk. Sometimes they're fantastic beings. Very often there's magic, not always, but most of the time. And the rules of the natural world are usually violated. But fantasy is not just anything goes. Fantasy worlds have rules, and magic has rules, and you have to abide by those. When we focus on fantasy for children, a lot of people think novels, but it can actually be written all the way from picture books all the way up through middle grade. It's an extremely popular genre. Kids love to read fantasy. Very often fantasy appears in trilogies, books of sets of 3, or series, long-running series. Think Harry Potter, think Chronicles of Narnia, think the Warriors series, books like that. Sometimes, very often, it has its basis or its roots in folklore, traditional literature for myths, something like that. Okay, so some subgenres of fantasy, because everything's not the same. There's a wide variety of things that fit into fantasy. Animal fantasy is really popular, especially for the younger end of the middle grade readers, and also in a lot of picture books. In animal fantasy, the characters are animals, but they act like people. So they'll dress up, they'll talk. Some aspects of their behavior may be the same as animals, but a lot of times they act a lot like people. And you see one example there, Aaron Hunter's Warriors series that has, I don't know how many volumes in. Some more examples, Kate DeCamillo's The Tale of Despero, which is a standalone. It's all just one book. Brian Jacques' Redwall series, and a picture book, Not Quite Narwhal there, which is about a unicorn who discovers narwhals and thinks that that's what he is and decides he's going to go live with them. And that book actually has a sequel that's coming out soon. Another subgenre is contemporary fantasy, sometimes called magical realism. It takes place in our world, but there is magic. You have books like Ghost Squad, which is about a couple of kids who investigate the paranormal. You have Love, Sugar, Magic, which is again about a contemporary girl in our time who experiments with magic. So the setting is our world, but it still has magic in it and magical characters. When we get to our diverse reading, which is The Total Eclipse of Nestor Lopez, that's a good example of contemporary fantasy. And actually, Tay Keller's book, When You Trap a Tiger, is also a good example of contemporary fantasy. Fantasy can be direct retellings or based very squarely in folklore and fantasy. So sometimes you get reimagined versions of traditional tales, or worlds imagined that have their basis in mythology, or what they call fractured fairy tales. So you see a couple of examples there. You see The True Story of the Three Little Pigs, which is the wolf's version of that story. He had a cold and he sneezed, and it's not his fault the houses fell down, and he wasn't going to leave a dead pig there. What a waste of food. You have The Lightning Thief by Rick Riordan, which is set in the world of Greek mythology. And then Ella Enchanted by Gail Carson Levine, which is a retelling, of course, of Cinderella. Then you also have miniature worlds, or toys or dolls that come to life. A couple examples there. The Velveteen Rabbit is a much older example, but it's a stuffed animal who comes to life and learns what it means to be real. And then Toby Alone, and then also The Miraculous Journey of Edward Tulane, which is about a China rabbit who comes to life. And again, these tend to be popular with younger readers. Also, quests and imagined worlds. So this is what is sometimes called high fantasy, because it involves these quests, going off to find something or lose something. So you have the Chronicles of Narnia. That's a portal fantasy, because the children start off in our world, and then they go through the wardrobe, and they end up in a magical world called Narnia. And then you have The Golden Compass, and that series by Philip Pullman, which is a reimagining of Oxford University in England. And then you have the Harry Potter books, which of course move back and forth between the world of the Muggles, the real world, and the fantasy world of Hogwarts. Okay, so one of the things to think about this week is whether or not fantasy is a genre that you read, and what the advantages of fantasy would be for young readers. So it's one of the things we can talk about in discussion is, why would you let or recommend a young reader to read fantasy as opposed to realistic fiction? And so that is a useful thing to think about.